All right, well, I didn't end up going and cutting beans. I went and walked, well, the one field that I cut that we rutted up really bad, that first one. Ain't no way in heck I'm getting over that one anytime soon. And I went and walked the other two that I have left really good, and there are too many spots where I could barely walk across it and keep my footing, let alone try to get a combine across it. It's like, there ain't no sense in trying, because all I'm going to do is go out there and get stuck. And if I go out there and get stuck and rut it up, it's just going to make it that much harder to cut when the tracks show up and I can get over it, because you're going to have mud pushed up everywhere from the ruts. It's just like, I don't want to. I'd rather be cutting beans. But if all you're going to do is go out there and make a mess out of it and not get anything accomplished, what's the point? You end up knocking down beans and wasting time, wasting fuel, wasting money, getting stuck, breaking stuff. It's just not worth it. So anyhow, that didn't end up happening. Wire transfer went through, tracks are paid for. He was getting with the shipping company. I called the shipping company when I got off of work and touched base with them. The guy that has the tracks is touching base with him when he gets off, or when he gets done today. He's gonna send him an email with all of his contact, or with his address and all that crap. So, and then tomorrow morning, the lady at the shipping company is gonna get back with me. We're gonna get everything squared away, and they are still very confident that everything will be taken care of before the end of this week. So, fingers crossed. But anyhow, the reason we're standing back out here in a cornfield is because I got a comment on the video of chopping stalks, which this happens. I've had to explain the whole stalk chopping situation several times over the years, and it seems like as more people show up every couple years, I got to re-explain the situation. But we're kind of back in the cycle again of having to re-explain the situation, because I had a comment yesterday from a guy that said he saw no reason for it. It was just wasting time and diesel fuel, and a chisel plow would do the same thing. So if that's what he wants to believe, fine. That's his prerogative. But the way he was wording his comments, because there was several, no bad exchanges, but there were several comments made, and kind of the way he worded them, I'm guessing that A, he's actually not either a farmer, or B, he's a steering wheel holder and doesn't put a whole lot of thought into the process. He just goes through the motions, doesn't really think about any of the effects of what he's having is doing, or what he does is having on things. So real quick, it's probably going to be a little bit more, or a little bit longer than real quick, but we're going to talk about chopping corn stalks. I shouldn't say chopping corn stalks, because the main thing we're talking about here is sizing residue, which can be done with more than a stalk chopper, which we will touch on as we progress. So first things first, I got some numbers for you. These came from both Purdue and I think it was Penn State, but I wanted to have a couple different sources just to double check, and they both basically had the same numbers. So on a per ton basis of dry corn fodder, on average, you have 22 pounds of nitrogen, 8 pounds of phosphorus, which the vast majority of the phosphorus pulled off in a corn crop goes off in the grain. That's where most of the phosphorus is held up in a corn plant, is in the ear itself. So that's why that phosphorus number is so low. And then potassium is 32 pounds. Now that's per dry ton. And you figure on an average 150 bushel corn crop, so these numbers go up as your bushels increase, but we're using 150 bushel corn crop here as our base. So for 150 bushel corn crop, you figure roughly 4 tons of fodder per acre. So that brings you up to 88 pounds of nitrogen per acre held up in the stover, 32 pounds of phosphorus held up, and 128 pounds of potassium, because there's a lot of potassium held up in the stalk itself. That's where most of the potassium gets put in a plant. So with that being said, why is this important? Well, all all those nutrients are being held in an organic form because they're in the plant. They're in an organic form. They've already been taken up by the plant. So the minute that plant rots down and breaks down back into its basic components and goes back into the soil again, all those nutrients are immediately plant available again. They don't have to go through a cycle. They just have to rot down, and they're there and ready for the next year's crop to use. So that being said, especially with the nitrogen that's held up, the microbes that are in soil that break down plant material use nitrogen as their energy source, fuel source. So a lot of the nitrogen that is, hold up. Okay, sorry about that. So back to the nitrogen real quick, because we'll get the nitrogen out of the way and then we'll get back into the meat and taters of things. So the vast majority of the nitrogen that's in corn stover actually gets used up by the microbes in the soil as they are breaking down the plant material. So the nitrogen doesn't really carry over to next year's crop. I was hoping to find a number for you guys that would tell me like the average pounds of nitrogen per acre that they figured to break down a ton of corn stover, but I could not find that number anywhere. But I did find out, which is something I'd never really heard of, but I guess it's more common like Illinois, Iowa, that way, because most of the research I was finding on it was from Iowa State and Illinois State. Apparently out there it is common practice, or at least it sounds like common practice. I don't know how many people actually do it, but if a university is researching it, it must be done at least to some extent, that after harvest they go through and spray on with, or do a spray application of 28% UAN to apply nitrogen that in theory is supposed to speed up plant breakdown, because it's supposed to boost microbial activity because it's giving them an extra bit of fuel source. But apparently from all the research I was finding, it doesn't actually really increase plant material breakdown to the point that it's worth doing. So that's the nitrogen out of the way. But the phosphorus and the potassium, like I say, immediately go back into the soil, and they are available for next year's corn crop or next year's bean crop or whatever you're planting behind the corn. So now that you understand the nutrients held up in corn stover, corn fodder, corn residue, all those terms that we use to describe what's left over after you shell corn, why is it important to size residue with a stalk chopper or anything like that? Which I guess real quick we will touch on the equipment used to do this. So you know, back in the early, like from the horse and buggy days all the way up through until probably the late 80s, stalk choppers were the thing. And why were stalk choppers the thing? Because every full line manufacturer and most short line companies offered some sort of stalk chopper or a brush hog with a stalk chopper kit or whatever. So why were stalk choppers so common? Well, because old corn heads like mine leave you stalks like this, 24, 16, 24 inches tall, not necessarily broke off. Or if you go even further back than that, old corn pickers that use snapping rolls didn't have stalk rolls and stripper plates and stuff like some of the new idea. I think if I remember right, Alice Chalmers was actually the first one to have a corn picker that used stripper plates instead of snapping rolls. But anyway, I digress. So corn pickers and older corn heads and everything made really tall residue. There's some corn pickers that, I mean, you look at the job they did and you can't hardly tell that they went through and picked anything, because literally they just snapped the ears off the stalk and kind of like leaned the stalk over a little bit, but they didn't do anything. So hence why stalk choppers were so popular from the dawn of time until like late 70s, early 80s. But as things progressed and guys were looking to become more efficient and make less passes over the field and yada yada yada, Today, you don't really see stalk choppers being used because they basically were made obsolete by improvements, well, A, the disappearance of the corn picker, and B, improvements in corn head technology, because now guys are doing all their residue sizing in one pass using the corn head on the combine. Because you got companies like Calmer and all these aftermarket companies that makes chopping rolls to retrofit older corn heads to run chopping stalk rolls. Most new corn heads come from the factory with chopping rolls on them. If you don't buy a complete chopping head that's got the more blades and flails and whatever they have underneath at ground level to finish chopping the residue after the stalk rolls pulled it down. So that's why you don't see anybody using stalk choppers anymore, is because basically they became obsolete because corn head technology progressed far enough that you don't need to run a stalk chopper anymore because the corn head's doing it all on its own. And part of the reason that it took corn head technology so long to progress is because chopping rolls require more horsepower to run because they have tighter tolerances. They're pulling harder on the stalk. They're doing more work. And then a complete chopping head requires even more horsepower. So combine horsepower had to catch up in order for corn head technology to advance to the point where you could basically do all this in one pass. So now you run through a cornfield with a modern corn head, it's basically going to look like this right behind the combine. So for those that are going to say, I don't need to be chopping stalks because nobody runs stalk choppers anymore, almost everybody runs stalk choppers now. It's just the stalk chopper's built into the corn head, so you're doing it all in one pass. So there's the equipment side of things out of the way. So now we come to, why is it important to size residue? Corn, or corn fodder, is what's the word I'm looking for here? There's a certain term, there's two terms used to describe residue, and now I'm blanking on the one for corn residue. Hold on, because this is going to bug me. I got to figure it out real quick. Okay, I was way overthinking it. So there's two types of residue. There's fragile residue, which is like soybean stubble, wheat stubble, stuff like that. That's not very heavy stemmed, real easy to break down. Doesn't create a whole lot of crop residue. And then you have non-fragile residue, which is things like corn, sunflowers, sorghum, things like that have really massive stalks and create a lot of excess fodder. So fragile residue is very easy to break down because A, the stalks are really small, and B, there's not a whole lot of it. Non-fragile residue is very hard and time consuming and energy consuming for the soil microbes to break down. And one of the biggest well, A, you got the size of the stalk, and then on things like corn, if I can get a stalk out of the ground here for you. So you see how that stalk is shiny? Just like humans have skin, there are some plants, not all of them, but a lot of them, especially grasses, have what's called a cuticle, which is a wax layer that covers the entire stalk of the plant that basically acts as like what skin does on a human to help keep, it's basically a protective layer to help keep disease and stuff like that out of the plant. That wax layer, while that stalk is laying on the ground, does the same thing as it does when the corn plant is standing up. It takes soil microbes a long time to eat their way through that wax layer so that they can even begin to start breaking the plant down. So, how do we counteract this? Sizing residue. The more you can break up that stalk and spread the fodder out, the more surface area you create for those soil microbes to act on. The more surface area they have to act on, the more microbes can eat on any individual piece of fodder. The faster you break down that fodder, the faster you return those nutrients back into the soil, the faster they can become part of the nutrient cycle again, and the quicker they're available for next year's crop. So with that being said, now that you know that, what do you think is going to break down faster? Corn residue that looks like this, where you got stalks still sticking up out of the ground, not in soil contact with anything whatsoever, or this. The other thing that chopping corn heads and stalk choppers and stuff do is, notice the residue is evenly spread over the width of the field now. So when those nutrients do return back into the soil, you don't end up with like windrows, because if you would look at it, if you would pull cores across the width of the field, let's say you're running like a 12-row machine and you don't have any sort of chaff spreader on the back, like a tailing, I'm not talking like a spreader or a chopper underneath the walkers, I'm talking like a tailing spreader down on the axle to catch the tailings coming off of your shoe. That would show up if you were testing for nutrients, as it would look like a windrow and then a skip and then a windrow and then a skip. It would basically look exactly the same as if you were spreading fertilizer and you were putting too many distances in between your passes and you were leaving a skip in between fertilizer spreader passes, because you have this bunch of biomass laying right in the center of the combine and you're not spreading it over the entire width of the head. So you took 12 rows of fodder and you're down into, you know, a 3-row width, because that's how wide the body of the combine is, which is why chaff spreaders and stuff like that are important, especially in no-till situations where you're not going to use any tillage to spread the fodder out any more than what the combine's done. So that brings us to tillage. Why does it matter to size the residue if you're going to come through and chisel plow it anyhow? Well, for starters, if you're going to come out here and chisel plow this, even with a disc chisel, stalks like this that are still tall and tough and stringy, especially if you're chisel plowing like in the morning when the dew's on, or if they've had a rain on them or whatever, you're going to end up with, I don't care what disc chisel you're running, because I've run everything from my little soil saver all the way up to a full high clearance sunflower disc, you know, full size sunflower disc chisel. I guess you could call it a disc ripper at that point. If the stalks are tough, they're going to ball up in the chisel plow. They might not plug the plow, but they're going to ball up together, and by the time they get all the way through the plow, you're going to end up with plug piles everywhere. And anybody that's ever chisel plowed has seen them, or been driving by a field that somebody chisel plowed and the stalks are tough, and you see little plug balls everywhere scattered throughout the field that you got to try to scatter out when you go through with your finishing pass in the next fall, because that ball is, you know, got no soil contact, so it's not gonna break down, and that same ball that's there in the fall is gonna be there in the spring, because there was no way for anything to get there to break it down. So it makes it easier to bury, or it makes it easier to plow to begin with, because the residue goes through the plow better. And then if you're gonna chisel plow it and incorporate it, you come back to the same thing of, you get it into the ground, it's in more broken up, smaller pieces, so when it's incorporated into the soil, you have even more surface area, because you're now got soil 360 degrees around those chunks of residue. It's broke up, the cuticle's been scraped off and whatever from going through the chopper or going through the stalk rolls or whatever. So the smaller you get the pieces, the more surface area you have, the faster it's going to break down, yada yada yada. It's the benefits just keep stacking up. That's why companies have invested so much money in creating tools to size crop residue. So like I say, if you come through and chisel plow stalks in like this, they've still got the wax layer on them. You're not going to do as good a job incorporating them, which if you're in a situation where you want residue on top, or large residue on top for erosion control, then that's an entirely different deal completely, and there's reasons for that too. It's nothing we got to worry about around here. So if you're following along here, just chisel plowing in residue that looks like this that hasn't been processed is not the same as chisel plowing residue in that looks like this. And if I can find, as a for instance, and it doesn't work, it would work better if my combine was set up to straddle the rows and I didn't have 2 rows that got run down by the tires. And if you can work it out in such a way where you chop in the opposite direction that you combine, so that you can like get underneath the stalk and pick them back up and flip them back over and do it, but it's just, that turns into a lot of work. So, but even if you look at it, like, it took a stalk from, you know, yay tall to yay tall, blew the end all out, kind of shattered it. So now, like I say, it's got, microbes have a way to get in there and start working on that. And so yeah, like that right there, that's all blown apart. So yeah, that's basically what I got for you. That's the whole principle behind sizing crop residue and breaking things down as fast as possible. And in a soil type like ours, where it's a lot of heavy ground, gets wet real easily, is saturated for a lot of the winter and early spring, because soil microbe activity greatly drops off once soil temperature drops below 50 degrees. And in a situation where the soil is saturated, it also creates a low oxygen environment, or there's 2 types of soil environments. Actually, these two terms apply to more than just soil, but we're talking about soil. So you got aerobic, which means in the presence of oxygen, and anaerobic, which means lack of oxygen. So when the soil becomes saturated, you create an anaerobic environment, which also slows down microbial activity, which also slows down crop residue decomposition. So anything that you can do to aid along breaking down that crop residue is worth it. And like on stalks like this, I guarantee you, well, before I started chopping stalks, because there was a time back before I started doing 30-inch rows, really didn't need to chop them because it wasn't that big of a deal with my 3-point chisel plow. But really had to start chopping them once I switched to 30-inch rows, because there was too much residue for that 3-point plow that I had to get through it, and I just created a dump rake. But I digress. You could come out here in the cornfield. So if I had corn here this year and then beans next year, and then the following corn crop, you could come out here and there would still be hunks of cob and hunks of stalk and whatnot if you dug down a little bit that hadn't been rotted down yet. Now, I guarantee you the vast majority of this fodder, even if I don't get any groundwork done this year, which, unless we have a really dry November and December stays dry, there probably ain't gonna be a whole lot of chisel plowing getting done, so it's just gonna be relying on whatever breaks down on the surface. But I will guarantee you that if I don't get this worked in, about the only thing that will be left here that hasn't been fully rotted down by next spring will be the nubbins that are still hooked to the root ball. I guarantee you that almost all the fodder in between the rows, especially like the husks and stuff like that, will be damn near gone, and what is left will be the consistency of wet paper, and you can pick it up and it just like falls apart as powder. That's how fast this stuff breaks down, as long as you size it correctly. If you don't size it correctly, it doesn't work. So yeah, residue sizing is important. That's why so many companies have invested so much time in creating tools to make it easier and faster to size residue. And just because you don't see guys pulling stalk choppers all over the place anymore doesn't mean guys still aren't chopping stalks. It just means they're doing it with a corn head. They're not having to make the second pass to do it with a stalk chopper. So hopefully that clears that up, and hopefully, well, I have to put I should have put the disclaimer at the beginning of the video. None of this was meant to be educational. None of this was meant to be a how-to. None of this was meant to be everybody needs to do it this way, because I don't really care how you do it. This is just the way I'm going to do it. If you don't want to do it this way, that's perfectly fine. You do what works best for you. I'll do what works best for me. And I have no clue what I'm talking about. So there's the disclaimer. That way nobody can come back and say dumb things. So anyhow, that should take care of the topics I wanted to cover. So with that being said, that's it for this one. We'll catch you guys on the next one.